Hi, everyone. And there, hi.
Hello. Look at us getting more and more adept at this.
Uh, I mean, you should have seen me like 5 seconds ago.
You're doing great. One of these days I'll be brave enough to try to start it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's not too complicated. It looked like I was going to be able to do it on my computer, but it's telling me I need some kind of software, so I'm just going to
Oh,
leave it alone. So,
yeah.
but
I know when
how are
you
you?
said that, I thought, oh, great.
Yeah.
That would be easier, but we'll do what we can. I know I did something on my computer real and only then realized that I think my webcam is really poor quality. So we have some tech
Yeah,
situations on our
I know. I
hands.
get that figured out. I just did a podcast recording, and this has happened to me twice now. My laptop is old enough that the podcasting platforms that people use where it captures video and sound and stuff they don't work on my laptop. So it's happened twice where I've like gone to join to like record the podcast, and all of a sudden I'm scrambling to like do a mobile version or whatever. So I think I need to
Yeah,
deal with my tech situation.
I
But
hear you.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, hello. Happy Friday.
Happy
Who
Friday.
else would I spend Friday with talking Tradwife?
I
I
know.
love it. As I was getting ready, I was like, oh, I love the internet brought us together.
I know.
That's a,
I had to laugh at your post about like what there's like nothing more like parenthood than just like Friday night's good. That's great.
yeah,
What else would
sounds
I do?
great. I don't have anything going on.
Yeah.
That's the best time.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually really is the best time for us. Everybody is tired and goes to sleep early.
Tired.
So, but
Exactly.
people
Yeah.
probably aren't quite asleep at your house yet, I
They're
wouldn't.
not. My husband's on bedtime tonight, so thankful for that. And hello to a few friends. We didn't know if we'd get any people joining on
Yeah,
Friday night. So hello,
I know.
friends
Hello.
who've joined.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been excited to talk to you live about Tradwife stuff because it's sort of been like a ongoing conversation, and it seems to be getting more and more. I don't know, not more and more, but it's changing and kind of
Yeah.
gaining intensity and getting attention from new places and
Hmm.
whatever else.
Right. I
So
saw CNN did an article this week, and just it's in the air. I
yeah,
think people are talking about this.
yes, it is. So, and there's a lot. I mean, I can point people a bunch of different
Hmm.
places to the folks who are doing some really interesting writing about this already. Um, but I wasn't really like looking to get all that involved in the discourse because, our project is sort of, defined as looking at Christian parenting, know, advice and literature. And so when I was working on that, what we have right now is I think the last chapter on Christian parenting influencers.
Hmm.
I just like started getting these Tradwife posts, and I was like, okay, yeah. At first, I didn't really think much of it. Like I was just sort of like, oh, these are like the homestead,
Hmm. Hmm.
crunchy moms that I'm like aware of. I'm like aware of crunchy as like a category, but I wasn't
Yeah.
aware of Tradwife as a category
Yeah.
until I started seeing them over and over again. And I was like, oh, this is a whole thing. Because before I started doing that research over last like end of the summer,
Hmm.
I was not like looking, I was not really on TikTok. I didn't spend any time looking at
Hmm.
reels. Like video content
Hmm.
was not a thing I even looked at. And then like as soon as I did, it was like right
Everywhere.
there. Um,
Well, there's
and
a
yeah,
lot of overlap too, right? Even
so
between like the
that,
crunchy and then into Tradwife,
yeah,
or it kind of, I don't know, bleeds into different things and rubs up against different things.
mm-hmm,
I think it was really interesting. I don't know if you saw last week, and as a result, I think some people are familiar with the term and others aren't. Like I don't know if you saw last week. I think Allie Beth Stuckey commented. I don't know where she was on. She was on a stage, but kind of commented and voiced her opinion that Tradwife isn't necessarily biblical.
yeah,
And wow, she got a lot of pushback. And I think some of it was people defending the movement, and many people I think thought she meant traditional values or something like
yeah,
this. So I think there's also a lot of that going on, both with people consuming it and the people thinking about it. Um, so yeah, how would you, if you had to define it, how would you define it?
yeah. So I kind of had to do this because I'm writing about it. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's such an online phenomenon
Yeah.
that writing for like a general, much less online audience, I found myself thinking through this, but you know, I would, so there's kind of Tradwife content and there's Tradwife influencers. And
Mm-hmm.
Tradwife influencers are influencers. So this cohort of influencers, people who use their personas and their lifestyles to sell
Mm-hmm.
something. So these are people who are making content using themselves
Yeah. Yeah.
as kind of the, I don't know, the product is the wrong word,
Mm-hmm.
but as the content, um, who are kind of evangelistically modeling what they consider to be a
Mm-hmm.
traditional expression of being a woman and a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about as specific as I think you can get
Mm-hmm.
with a definition,
Mm-hmm.
because once you kind of start looking at Tradwife content, you realize how all over the place it is in terms of
Yeah.
what traditional actually means, right?
Yeah. And
Um,
why people are motivated. Like
yeah,
I was gonna read
yeah,
it before we got on and I didn't have a chance, but someone had linked to a couple years ago, someone interviewed the woman, the Tradwife content creator that does all the homemade cereal. Do you
yes,
know what I'm talking
yes,
about?
yes, yes,
And
yes,
she actually isn't even really sold on the movement. She was just wanted, she had a goal to be an influencer. She wanted to be a successful influencer. So she
yeah.
kind of was analyzing the themes and kind of sees it a little bit as
Mhm.
cosplay. Like, so it's interesting to think of like the whole range between people like that to people who in the Christian circles are, influencing others to say this is godliness, this is closer to godliness, this is an alignment with biblical values in different ways. And so I think they would be sincere in a way that others who are maybe trying it on as a trend are not.
Yeah, yeah, gosh, there's such a
Yeah.
range. I mean, there definitely is that. I mean, because like there are some folks who are a lot more self-aware and
Mm-hmm.
even refer to themselves as tradwives in a way that I think they're sort of at this point have identified that it's a marketing tactic, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some that sort of self-consciously are doing that, but a lot of the faith-based content or the faith-forward content is not. And that's why I'm really interested in it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because the first time I came across a post that kind of reads as a tradwife post, my first thought was, okay, this person is probably either Mormon or evangelical, like
Mm-hmm.
that, like um, because gender and the definition of womanhood versus manhood and the distinction between the two is so important for American evangelicals. And we're kind of in the middle of this gender war at the moment. Um, it was really, it just seemed automatic to me that it was like this must be part of that battle. Like this has to be part of that gender war in some way.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
as
so
soon as when I saw it, I thought immediately of the Dominionist movements of the 90s and 2000s because it's very similar. Social media wasn't around then, but via blogs and magazines and catalogs in certain
yeah.
instances, that was the marketing selling point, and it very much was. I don't know if it was overt in quite the same way that the trend is, as much as old fashioned values are better and safer and more in alignment with Christian values. So we will dress up in Jane Austen era clothing, or we will dress up in Little House on the Prairie era clothing. And often was, I think the clothing and aesthetic was a little bit more recognizable for women, even
Mm-hmm.
in those eras, even though there was content for men. But I
Mm-hmm.
also want to talk about trad men and how that plays out in Christian circles. I don't even know what the term would be. I haven't really heard trad men used, but I
No,
don't know.
I don't know. I don't know what the, yeah, but there definitely is a kind of a parallel. But
Yeah.
could you? So I'm curious. Did you have any? What were your run-ins with like the more dominionist fundy stuff in like the 2000s? Were you
Yeah.
aware of that
That's
existing?
a good question. I mean, I think anyone who was parenting in Christian circles and home educating, because I believe we've done all kinds of different things, but was homeschooling in different times over the years, you're running up against that, right? You're at conferences, the resources that are recommended had a lot of that.
Yeah.
And then it's a little bit of a there's a lot of interconnectivity there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the groups are insular. So I don't know if I ever, growing up, I knew some people who were in IBLP or something like that, but I don't know if I ever knew people in the 2000s who were going to the Vision Forum conferences or something like in real life.
Mm-hmm.
People handed me those resources or, set out the Above Movies magazines at homeschool co-ops, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was circulating in that way. And then for me, more my awareness grew as I was researching and learning for the novel I wrote, because then I was coming across all of this. And even, especially I think in the blogging era, there was a lot of, as we've talked about before, so much of that was almost the precursor to influencer culture.
Yeah.
And I think especially for Christian mothers and stay-at-home daughters or young women, this became a way to process their thoughts. Maybe it was viewed as a ministry, like to encourage other like-minded young women, and it was community in for people who maybe were a little bit isolated in other ways.
Yeah.
And I think the pull for men was a little bit less than, like, if I had to articulate tradmen, I would think it's more hyper patriarchy seems to be going with
Yeah.
tradwife culture.
That's right. Sorry, I'm moving around here, but
Oh, you're good.
Yeah. So I'm so curious. So as I've been researching this, I've talked to a couple of, actually three, so two scholars and one person who was sort of in it in the more kind of fundy dominionist circle, 90s, because I was sort of, in hindsight, I can see it because I grew up in North Carolina, Southern Baptist, and my mom homeschooled me for a little while. And I think, my parents had brushes with it over the years. And now when I talk to someone like Tia Levings, for example, who very generously talked to me for this article that I'm working on,
So
she was
great.
describing to me the kinds of things that she would see at the conferences that she'd go to. And I am just floored, one, by the kind of like weird harmonizing with my own experience I wasn't aware of because I was
Really? I didn't know
younger,
that. Yeah.
like just the reasons why, for example, evangelicals might have been very enthusiastic about American Girl dolls and Laura Ingalls Wilder, the reasons why that was so resonant. But then other things, like she shared with me experiences of going to conferences, and I had never heard of breadbeckers. Have you heard of breadbeckers?
I haven't. I'm
There,
curious.
there were like these like bread and wheat influencers that were like milling their own wheat. You
Oh, I
buy
do
your
remember
own,
people milling their own wheat.
yeah, you'd like buy your own, like you'd buy flour from them
Yep.
because it wasn't tainted by the mark, and you'd make your own bread and you'd learn to make sourdough, and it was like this separatist thing.
Yep.
Very much, yeah. I see someone in the chat like recognizes the bread
Yes.
backers. I had never heard of this. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, no, it was absolutely understood. It was like partly prepping, partly kind
Yeah.
of this doomsday, like prepping for Y2K,
Right.
but also this like hyper separatist vision
Yep.
of Christianity and of what it meant to be like a prepared woman and family, and
Yeah.
so self-sufficient. The reason why the kind of like Laura Ingalls Wilder probably also resonated with folks, this vision of family insularity and self-sufficiency. So that I was just, I could have listened to her share this for hours and hours, because she just, as she's describing this, I'm thinking, wow, these are like the same, they're pulling on the same interests over and
They
over again.
are. Well, and I
Sourdough.
think it appeals absolutely. Oh gosh, is this me again doing the I meant to get this fixed after my last live. I don't know if it's me or if it's my phone, or I don't know if it's Instagram live. Do you hear the little echo, or is it okay?
No,
Oh,
I don't hear anything.
maybe it's just my phone. Okay, hopefully that won't bother anyone else. But yes, and I think, as we've talked about before, it really appeals to longings, right? It appeals to longings to nourish your family, to take care of your home, to create something beautiful and lovely. And I think there's a collaboration, a community effort in what I think artificial artificially became a really isolated family life. I mean, artificially, what I mean by that is when we think of traditional, we talked before, tradwife aesthetic is not tied to historical reality.
No, no.
So, but to replicate it in the 90s, the 2000s, or today, if you're isolated in suburbia, if you're on a homestead by yourself, car dependent, you know, you're not in an extensive community or something, it's pretty isolated. So there is this sense of like, I'm connected to the other people doing this online, I'm connected to the influencer doing it. And if you as a woman have been told home is your outlet, there's an inherent challenge there. There's maybe an outlet for your creativity, something to really challenge you maybe. And I think there's a draw to that. I think that's why people ended up with the bread, making extra work for themselves, almost a little bit.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's the making extra work. I mean, I think that sort of like gets into the facade, the fakeness of this, right? I mean, first of all, to the isolation thing, that's one thing that Tia talked quite a bit about, was the loneliness of trying to emulate this kind of insular, self-sufficient, self-contained family. Just how lonely and isolating that was. And that was hard to hear and made me sad to think of the women who were sort of isolated in these little worlds trying to create this, you know, this kind of life that felt and looked a certain way just by themselves. That made me really sad.
And kind of bolstered by these, like, I think of Mary Pride's The Way Home, On the Way Home, something like this, super popular in the 80s, and a kind of book of like, let's return home to all the Christian women. Like, you should be at home. You should be based at home. You should be very above rubies. All these people kind of like a narrowing and narrowing and narrowing of a woman's sphere. And there's such a sliding scale of that. Like, someone maybe could have read those things and been like, well, that's mitigated by church or a robust additional life. But for a lot of women, it just kept getting smaller and smaller. And for the children too, really.
Yeah. Yes. And you know, that reminds me, she also spoke about how in the circles that she was in, there was this movement toward family integrated churches. I don't remember.
Yeah, that's what it's called.
And how on the surface that appears to be like such a communal way of living, but in her experience, it ended up being so even further isolating, because there would be no opportunity for women to have, or children for that matter, to have spiritual lives and community away from the head of the household, away from their husband, right? Like, it's this bringing under of the family's whole worship experience, their whole church community experience under the head of the husband, kind of in the name of family and traditional values and bringing children back into worship, which I'm all for. I think that's a wonderful thing. But I had not thought of that, and I wasn't really aware of that as being one of the animating forces behind that, kind of even closer restriction of women. And that was interesting too.
And the isolation, because I think it really speaks to a puritanical impulse of like, what is going to be pure enough or godly enough. You know, now the authority of a conservative church is not acceptable. You know, it needs to come even more. Only families that think like this, or in the most extreme cases, only our family. And I think the impact on the women, the impact on children in the household, because it always came alongside homeschooling, I think. So everything becomes in there. And I think, you know, it should be said, I don't think all tradwife influencers are on that trajectory. But it's worth saying, I think what's unique maybe about influencer culture and also not is the people propagating this are often living by different rules.
Yes.
You know, both for the content creators, but even when I think of those days, you know, or currently, like Nancy Campbell of Above Rubies, she lives on a hillside with multiple extended families. Helpers come, families send teenage girls to volunteer to be helpers. The people showing this lifestyle are not the ones isolated at home with, many young children being told to do everything all on their own. And this was interesting. We did get one question I thought that was interesting. I kind of want to talk about a little bit from a woman who's from the Mennonite tradition. And so she was saying, just kind of exploring, we kind of messaged back and forth a little bit. Okay, but this is her heritage. This is a part of sharing her actual life would be traditional skills. That's a value in the Mennonite tradition and their community. I was thinking about this because I think about sometimes an editing project I do is for Anabaptist publication. I love it so much. Just Daughters of Promise, for those of you who are familiar with it. And as a result, I follow several of the Mennonite writers, and it's beautiful. Much of what they post is connected to homemaking and some of the overlap. So I appreciate her question because I think about that a lot, about the difference, because there's a distinct difference. And I think some of that is the authenticity of living something as part of your heritage in this community that has embraced it in a complex, multi-generational way, versus someone kind of trying it on for size by themselves at home, or inspired because of what's going on in the world around, out of fear or out of reactionary reasons, to do this in different ways. And even thinking about what you said about the isolation, thinking about how, at least in my understanding of the Anabaptist tradition and Mennonite tradition, community is such a huge part of that. There's an integrated community. It's not, even though there's maybe some of those same overlapping motivators, there's a robust communal nature. And so there's something about the isolation and independence of it that I think is unique, that's really taking the nuclear family and making it the measure of all things, and really the hub of everything in a unsustainable way. I don't know how people who try it really sustain it.
Yeah. And the Mennonite tradition has traditions outside of the aesthetic of what the woman is doing, right? Like the Tradwife, the Tradwife content, like the starting point is the aesthetic of what the woman is doing, right?
Oh,
Like,
that's interesting. Yeah.
the point is, let's re-enchant womanhood. Let's push back against feminism. I mean, sometimes it's very explicitly anti-feminist. Like, feminism has failed. Girl boss feminism has failed. This is a better vision of womanhood. Like, the practices of Mennonites or traditional Catholics, or I mean, pick your other, sort of conservative religious community. The aesthetics flow from a tradition.
Yeah.
The aesthetics of Tradwife content are not actually flowing from a tradition. Like, if they are flowing from a particular tradition, the tradition they're flowing from is a hyper feminine expression of womanhood. Like, that's as close to identifying a unifying tradition you can get. That's the reason why you have 1950s housewife, aesthetic. You have Victorian aesthetic. You have Regency England aesthetic. You have Laura Ingalls Wilder aesthetic. All of those fall under the Tradwife umbrella because they allow for this boiled down aesthetic that usually involves dresses and long hair, that is associated with whiteness. That is not in any way connected to a religious tradition, and so I do see questions like that a lot. And I like that question because it is like connected to a specific, like, well, what about me? Like, this is what my life looks like, but I'm not trying to
And would have, even if if social media didn't exist, this is what my life would look like. Yeah.
And sometimes I that's one question I wanted to talk with you about, was about the comments. There's basically along the lines of like, well, what if that's just what they like? Like, just let them have this thing. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? And my response to that is usually like, well, I have some sympathy for, or not sympathy. I understand that coming more from the Tradwife influencers who are really not at all faith forward. There aren't a lot of those, but there are some. that you can dig down into their profiles, like into the backstories and everything, and you can't really find any faith content. There are very few of those, but there are some. And that's, sure, if you want to cosplay being like Marilyn Monroe on the internet, that's fine. You can do that. Do I have other like questions about why sure, but the minute that you add spiritual claims though to like this is what womanhood looks like, and those claims are everywhere once you start looking for them. Like people will say, oh, no one is suggesting that, and I say, well, they might not come out and say like you all should do this, but the underlying implication is this is God's design for women. This is God's best for women. This is the pinnacle of the expression of God's design for women. Those claims are all there, and I really don't think it's a stretch to say that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think also there's the subtle messaging that I think we are so accustomed to being marketed to in commercials and advertised to that we like to think, I think we're above influence, but we are so influenceable. And so even if a influencer thinks, I'm just sharing this was a great content, a great reel, there's maybe not awareness of actually what that's playing out to, of actually how that's impacting people. And I think it's that same disconnect that even happened between leaders in these movements who were living in a certain way and then spouting this teaching and really out of touch with what it meant for people to try and live that out. Mm-hmm. And I think from a Christian perspective, there's maybe dishonesty. Is that the right word? There's a lack of integrity there that I think when you're positioning yourself as a model or as an example is dishonest. And that gets into things like, oh, you happen to have a personal assistant doing this, or you're doing a beautiful meal. I think I heard the Ballerina Farm influencer saying, she only does these beautiful meals every couple weeks, and it takes her 5 or 6 hours to do them over a couple days. And I appreciated her honesty with that. But when you see a reel like that with this beautiful meal and you're at home thinking, I want that, I have a longing for that, maybe whether I should be able to do it or I'm going to try and do that. And certainly, yes, the messaging. And I think maybe that gets confusing for people as well, because it reminds me a lot of Vision Forum as well, that would look back at earlier eras or understanding of earlier eras. And because it paired well with hard complementarianism, because it paired well with dominionism, that became the aesthetic. And so I think there's a way that those ideals pair well with beliefs about complementarianism, with beliefs about Christian patriarchy, with beliefs about even more general beliefs about women should be quiet workers at home. And here's something to come on in and define that, right? That's a familiar phrase we have. And here comes something that puts lights to it and, a reel and pretty music. And we think, oh, that's what a worker at home means. It means an apron and a flour covered counter and, milking the goats or something, like we have this idea. And really is shaped by, I'm glad you brought up the element of whiteness. It's really shaped by Western European tradition, ideas of what that looks like. Again, not necessarily accurate, but really looking to that.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And there are so many different directions to go in this conversation. But I talked to Julie Ingersoll, she's a professor of religious studies. She's a historian, and she writes about dominionism.
I have her book on my shelf somewhere. Building God's Kingdom, isn't that hers?
Yeah. And she had so many great thoughts about all of this. But one thing she raised about, because one thing that I'm particularly interested in is why so much of the content sort of relies on Christian audiences and Christian influencers. what about this is so appealing in particular to conservative Christians, because I really do think that it is. And she very kind of profoundly said that for decades now, gender has been core to what it is to be an evangelical in the United States. Like, you go back to Danvers' statement, many churches and evangelical denominations now, can have in their in their kind of statement of faith that you look at when you become a member, there's a clause in there about, this is what we believe about marriage, this is what we believe about male and female. It has become so important to evangelicals to define, this is what we believe about gender. We believe that men and women are different, and now it's all tied up in the gender wars. When I look at it now, I see sort of Tradwife content as a way of fighting that gender war. Like, I see that in there. And that just takes it out of the realm of like preference. It takes it out of the realm of live and let live, and into this very, I just think it's messy, because it's like, you can say that we're all sort of looking at this content with more discernment than we actually are, but if you're immersed in this content and the aesthetic kind of gets married to what you believe about womanhood, I think that, I don't know that we're all as aware of that as we would like to think that we are,
Absolutely.
And that bleeds into how we think about parenthood and motherhood and all of that. So
it makes me think of when you read the people in the 80s and 90s who were really strongly against women wearing pants, for instance, like, this became a hill for many to die on, because and not only like a clothing of godliness, but of submissive womanhood. It was a symbol of that, and trousers and pants were kind of a symbol of the woman working outside the home and being rebellious in this sort of way. And I think, I don't see like Tradwife influencers saying, Christian Tradwife influencers saying, you must wear a dress or something like that, but it has that same vibe of like, this clothing, and I don't just mean clothes, but this appearance is a way we do this. And we also push back against, like what you said, is getting very blurred, and now we have some of maybe those other pieces of external signs of a culturally defined femininity. We have, this getting very blurred in the broader culture. So no, it's not enough to just wear a dress, because men are wearing dresses, and this sort of sense of like, how do we define our understanding of these things? And so there can be a throwback to this and wholesomeness. And I have to wonder if too, some of the people, it's shaped the imaginations of some who grew up with American Girl dolls and Luring Goes Wilder and the steady diet of this, that when that's what you pull to, then when you're imagining that sort of thing. And I think for the men, I think of it as kind of adjacent to like the red pilled, like based hyper masculinity. There's a lot of overlap over there. Well, you'll see, I don't see it as much on Instagram, but I haven't really gone looking for it, but certainly on Twitter, I see it a lot. There are people who've built a name for themselves on Twitter, telling other men how to be hyper patriarchs, how to, be the head of the household in their home, how to, stop being fat and go to the gym. I mean, it's that kind of hard language of kind of like, that's no more soy boy this. And, it's interesting to think of it paired with the very soft, like almost pale lighting of Tradwife content, to have this very harsh and almost cruel edge, even in the vocabulary, to show the masculinity of the trad man content in that sense. And I think even less, some of those men, I think a year or two ago, went and spoke at some of the, I don't even know what the terminology for this would be, but like, it makes me think of like Andrew Tate and those guys, like in the secular sources. They went to speak at one of those conferences, and claims would be to evangelize or to spread the gospel, but there's shared ideals there about manliness that are being wrapped up and very directly of like, this is godly manhood. And so it'd be interesting, maybe at some point it'd be interesting to do a live with a Christian man who's kind of either come out of that or experienced that, to get that perspective of what that is like. Because when I think of Tradwife content, I think it's such a heavy yoke. It's so exhausting. It's such a treadmill that's promising something beautiful and really tapping into lovely longings. I don't think there's anything wrong with those longings for domesticity and beauty, but it really taps into that, and just, whoa, it's so heavy. And I wonder what that's like in the version for Christian men and fathers.
Yeah. I think I have not read it yet, but I've read a couple articles that he wrote as it came out. But Zachary Wagner has a book about masculinity, about Christian masculinity and toxic masculinity and all of that. And I've been meaning to read that, because that is such a part of this. I look at that too as like in a moment of like gender panic within American Christianity, there's this like just knee-jerk reaction to have women and men run to their separate sides, right? Like life content over here and the hyper masculine over here. And it's so interesting to me how that bleeds into, it sort of leads to this sort of like gendering of everything. Like I even see it down to like the gendering of music, like the gendering of
in the worship music,
of like particular kinds of music. There's a reason why men like to sing this kind of music, and this music is more masculine, it's more manly. And it leads to this like hypersexualization and hypergendering of everything, in a way that I like is just, it's so reactionary, right? Like it's so trying to stake out these very narrow definitions of manhood and womanhood to make sure that everyone knows what they are. Like I think there's this, the trope is like
feminization of the church,
that gender doesn't exist anymore. They're telling kids that nothing, men and women, or there's no difference, like, and which is not true. I've worked on pretty progressive college campuses, and never in my life have I heard someone in good faith say anything like that. No one is saying that. But I think there's this embattled, like there's an attack on Christian womanhood and Christian manhood, and it's leading to this doubling down on aspects of manhood and womanhood that are truly just culturally grounded.
I have to wonder, like, if it has a backfire effect, because when I speak with young adults who grew up in dominionist subcultures or something, for many of them, they say, look, I didn't fit hyper femininity or hyper masculinity, and there was such a narrow definition. It's almost the reverse of what the feminist movement tried to do or something. When it's so narrowly defined, then it becomes, I think, even more confusing for young adults to say, well, where do I fit? No, I'm not saying like our rigid gender roles were the impetus for all of the gender confusion people experience, but I do think there's a piece of it when you sort of tell young people, this box is what you fit in. If you don't, even in any capacity, then that is incredibly confusing. And when it's completely derived by these in performative ways, then I think it makes a lot of sense to me that a lot of people then are performing it in other ways, putting on different garb according to what feels right, because that's how it's been defined in this very kind of surfacey level way. So I think there's a lot of confusion with it, a lot of reaction, a lot of long-standing influences. So in some ways it's new and not new. I don't know.
Yeah. Julie was like, there's nothing new here. She was like, she was so great to talk to, but she was sort of looking at the messaging of Tradwife and the sort of parallel messaging toward men, and she was very clear, the message has not changed. This is like a redoubling down you know, what
All of
they're
the,
doubling
yeah.
down on over and so
Here
long.
someone says it makes the boxes so small. Yes. And especially for women, it pushes women away from the faith.
Yeah.
I think so. I think if you think, well, this is the only way, there's no place for me to be as an individual or a person, or when I think of different cultural expressions of masculinity and femininity. And that brings us back again to the kind of like European influence. You had a question about classical Christian education, I think. And
Yeah.
I really was like lit up, like, yes, absolutely. And you see this, there's so much overlap between all these movements. Dominionism, I mean, Doug Wilson kind of began the accreditation of classical Christian schools in the US. And so it's heavily influenced by that.
Yeah.
And the classical tradition itself isn't necessarily this way. And I think even in homeschooling circles, there are classical Christian educators who would not subscribe to this, but then there are those who really would. And it's a enchantment with the Western European tradition at the exclusion of all others. And I think that's a distinction. I think of Susan Wise Bauer, who's one of the most foremost, classical Christian educators, who wrote The Story of the World and of the World. Like this is a piece of classical Christian education. But often in classical Christian education in the US, you don't get that breadth that says that is able to do that. Instead, you get a very narrow, very Western European strain of thought, and it perpetuates the kind of water that all of this is swimming in, I think, because some of it's very slippery and difficult to pin down, but it normalizes it all. And everyone in the community is then normalizing that. I think I saw, oh gosh, this was a couple months ago, there was a classical Christian school that posted their summer reading list online, and kind of a like, really, and actually a very direct, like, look how much better we are than the public schools. This is what our kids will be reading over the summer or something. And it was fascinating to me that it was almost entirely, it was just such a sliver of literature. It was almost entirely, really white American stories of like the past 100 or 200 years, both authors and experiences. And there was nothing, like, most of those books were beloved books. A lot of them were Newbery, but it was interesting everything that was left out. And there wasn't something particularly classical about that book list. It just, the ideal was, these are older books that won awards and things like Narnia on there. It's great. We love Narnia. It's not like Narnia is bad or something, but it was this sort of, again, oh, well, we all know these are the best books or something. And sometimes I wonder if there's intentionality there. And I think there's case to be made for certain groups and certain subcultures there is. And sometimes I wonder if it's just ignorance and people who've swum in those waters for so long that they're unaware that, like, there is white supremacy at work, that there is, that's an exclusion. They're not even able to maybe see some of that. And then others, I think, are very clear about it. And it comes into, I hope I'm using this term. I don't know enough about this term to speak educationally about it, but in a very educated way about it. But what I've read of, like, kinism begins to crop up, this sort of like subculture that really wants to celebrate Western European civilization above all other civilizations, and tries to do it in this very, like, slippery way to, like, make it okay or something. And so I think that pops up. And I think the vast majority of people don't know that's maybe what they're brushing up against.
Right.
I think many people are drawn for all the reasons we've said, or maybe it aligns with their personal longings and personal things that they enjoy. But when you start talking about who's producing the content and who's consuming the content and who's running the conferences and who's kind of spearheading that, those sort of things crop up when you get to that level. And I mean, people who followed along know I have thoughts about Doug Wilson and No Quarter November. But I think he's a great example of this, because a lot of people are handed his resources at a homeschool conference or something like that, with no awareness of at all his
Yeah.
mission of Christian nationalism, his background, let alone the allegations of abuse and all of that, of failure to report abuse and all of that. But they're sort of drawn into that, and it sounds really good to have robust classical Christian education.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds great. And appeals to, I think, the academic leanings and the interests of a lot of people homeschooling, not for separatist reasons, homeschooling because they really want to offer a rigorous education or something like that. And they're maybe unaware of all of that. I think Julie's book, I've only read excerpts of it thus far, but is a great exploration of that, because you begin to see, oh, all these pieces have been connected for years and years and years, and a lot of them center around Rushdoony and these kind of who were very overtly, they did have a purpose and a plan in what they were doing, and wow, they were effective, because here we are decades later, and that plan is it still has traction.
Yeah, and I really do think we don't anymore, but we used to go to a church where there was a pretty strong classical conversations homeschooling movement.
Yeah.
At the time, I was sort of aware of that. But it was interesting talking to the people who were in that, because some of them were really just like, oh, this is how they used to educate people. There's a kind of this just like nostalgia, similar to Tradwife content, sort of like this imagined past where people were better educated and better thinkers and more intelligent or better read or something. Or they were kind of like the Charlotte Mason. Like, I think Charlotte Mason has, there's some great ideas there, but I also think there are a lot of folks who like Charlotte Mason because they like the aesthetic of tea and whatever, which is also fine. But the imagined past, what you perceive as being good about your particular imagined past, if it resonates with what, someone like Doug Wilson sees as a great imagined past, or a desired future, I think there, and I don't want to, blame people for sort of associations that they're not aware of when, like, it's really tricky to me because, again, I think I have a lot of friends who follow Tradwife accounts or accounts like this who are like, I was following her because like I like want to have chickens, or like I want to make sourdough, and this is so complicated because I don't want to blame people for these associations
Or shame people either. I mean, I feel like I think I've said it to you before, like if I could, I don't know, go to a farm on Prince Edward Island and create content and pretend I was Anne of Green Gables, I would do that. Are you kidding me? I can understand the appeal of a lot of that. And for me, the problems I have with it is when it comes with the prescription and the spiritualized language and authority that is telling other people to do it. And again, that lack of integrity between, oh yeah, someone said Dorothy Sayers. Okay. I was going to say that because I always laugh when I do think of that, because Dorothy Sayers, what did this person say? Yes, Doug Wilson. Karen Glass was on a podcast speaking about how Doug Wilson misinterpreted Dorothy Sayers' essays and how the neoclassical movement he started isn't even what actual classical education looks like in the past. Oh, that would be fascinating to hear. I was just thinking about how Dorothy Sayers, who kind of is thought to be the resurrection of the interest in this, was like as anti-Tradwife as it gets.
Right. Yeah.
Just as a woman, she wrote the essay, Are Women Even Human? She was a feminist. She was a scholar at Oxford when women weren't allowed to be. She kind of had a non-Tradwife past. In her personal life, and so it's interesting what will be picked and chosen as acceptable traditional wives. And Dorothy Sayers would not have been that. Oh, good, on the Mason Jar podcast. I'll look that up. Thank you. But I can't remember what I was saying. It probably wasn't important. Yeah.
I did want to return to the kind of Tradwife, Tradman discussion before we wrap up, just because I think I have not done a ton of sort of writing and research about the parallel universe of content sort of aimed at men. One thing that I am aware of is that it exists in a different place online than it does women. Like there's all kinds of research about who's spending time on the internet where. Instagram is heavily for women, right? And TikTok skews towards women too. Men are spending a lot more time
on where,
and that is,
where did you say TikTok?
On YouTube.
On YouTube.
Men are
totally, that makes sense.
And that's where a lot of the sort of hyper masculine content but it's showing up more and more on Instagram, and I'm curious to know why. I mean, I think people are building platforms and trying to capture as big of an audience as possible, but there are a couple of things that concern me about, I mean, there are a lot of things that concern me, but something that jumped out to me over the past month looking at this about the way that manhood and womanhood are being defined in this content is that one comment earlier mentioned that there's really small boxes for men and women content creates from a faith perspective. And it really falls along the very, like, you may have heard this line before that, manhood is hard fought and easily won. There's kind of this vision of in patriarchy, when does someone become a man? When he proves that he's a man, right? Like manhood is much more fragile as a you have to prove and earn than womanhood. And the content that I see really, really falls along those lines.
That's interesting.
Proving their providerhood, their ability to provide, proving their strength. I see so much Christian male content that has to do with lifting, exercise, bodybuilding,
gym,
proving physical prowess. And content that's for women is not so much about proving anything. It's about fitting that image. It's about, are you this? Then good. You can be this.
That's interesting.
And I think that's incredibly harmful to both. One is for men to have to prove themselves over and over again. They can't. Are you really a man? And for women, it says, if you are not this, I'm not sure that you can be what God intended women to be. Right. And I was thinking about this just recently when I was listening to a podcast about John Eldridge's book Wild at Heart. And the female kind of partner to that
captivating.
Book, captivating. And I remember reading that book as a high schooler and looking at the cover. And I was a very overweight, awkward, really struggled middle school and high school. I can remember having the thought, okay, there's a line in there where she's like, a woman blossoms when she's loved well. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there about how women are defined in relation to the men who love and protect them. And I remember it occurring to me as a high schooler. Well, I don't think, I'm not convinced that a man is actually ever going to love me. I maybe won't get to be this. Like, I maybe won't get to, does that leave me? That maybe leaves me in this sort of like genderless middle where none live, maybe this, I won't ever get to be the pinnacle of what God has intended for women. I won't get to experience that. And I think that Tradwife content and the similar for men, I mean, I think it's going to do the same thing for a lot of women,
Yeah, I think that's really apt, and it really fits with a lot of the archetypes that go along with it, that men are more active and women are more passive, and men build their vision and achieve them, and women are there to help support the vision. I think the fitting the mold for the women can also have things for them to do. I mean, I do think motherhood is a key piece of it in not all Tradwife content, but the Tradwife lifestyle, I would say. And especially when we're talking about pre-influencer days, that's the pinnacle there. And really women in their mothers in their childbearing years, because sure, grandmothers have some role to play, but it's not the center stage role. And it's certainly not the center stage of pregnancy. I think you talked about that, about how influencer content just bumps huge when an influencer is expecting, and children become props in this dominionist tradwife lifestyle. And I think I've said before, I think it's functionally narcissistic parenting, because the children are the extensions of really this dream, I think, of being kings and queens in your own little idealized world, even though the reality is rarely ideal. Like, I'm curious to think, when you mentioned more of the content for men is coming to Instagram, I have to wonder if how many of the followers are men, or if many of them are women. Because I think when you hear, this is just anecdotal, but you hear a lot of these, when I read stories or when I read the blogs back in the day, a lot of times families end up in these movements because the women are drawn to it, or say, I want to go to this homeschooling conference, or I want to do this, or I want to be able to stay at home in different ways. And it's interesting to think about maybe there being an audience for women to have an aspirational ideal of what a godly man looks like, a godly head of the home, and to kind of bring that in that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I am so I need to learn more how to really go about doing that quantitative research about who's following who, where, and where all that data is coming from. I don't have a great handle on that, but
yeah. Can you speak to, I got one more content, if we have any time, one more question about, well, someone mentioned about the pride and needing validation. I don't know if it was a question, someone just sort of observing that there's an element of that in both of these, but also someone kind of asked about the overlap between kind of anti-Western medicine frameworks. And I know you've done a little bit more looking into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think is the reason for that, would you say?
So much overlap. I mean, I think my sense is that it comes back to that fundamentalist separatist impulse.
Mm-hmm.
That
of maybe external authorities. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the this sort of separatist, the separatist impulse, the skepticism about expertise, I think definitely falls in there as well. And so I've been going back over and over again to this definition of fundamentalism that David French about a psychology that relies on ferocity and solidarity, more of a worldview than a religion.
Yeah.
And when I look at a lot of like really crunchy content, that's what I see, right? It's this fundamentalist obsession with what you're eating, what medicine you're taking, this need for control, right? Because when it's true, like when you go to the doctor and you take their word for it on what's wrong with you, and then you go to the pharmacist and you pick up, you take their word for it that they've made something that will help you. It's very opaque. There's so many layers of expertise that you have to trust in order to get from doctor to taking medication. Like, absolutely, that's true. And there's a real like sense of loss of control there. And understandably so. Like, I'm not saying our medical system is like perfect, but I think, one way of feeling like you're in control is by kind of developing this separatist way of seeing things. So I think a lot of Tradwife content relies on a similar psychology, but trying to hyper control your surroundings and what it feels like to be a wife and mother in your home.
I think too, there's some, I mean, in the same way that there's reactions to outside, I think that some people are reacting to experiences they had or things that they felt betrayed by. So maybe if they grew up, like I've heard from people, they grew up in a home, like kind of, I think we had a comment maybe maybe it was somewhere else, like pushing back, kind of like, well, I grew up in a home where my mom was never around, was always working, you know, this sort of thing. And so I really value that and want that. And so I think of that too, when people, if they feel like if they've been through the ringer with the medical system or something, they're, you know, like, well, I don't want that. So here's this thing, and it offers an illusion of, yeah, it's back under my control. And I have agency and choices. And I think it's very interesting that to see the combination of both of those things, of like, even down to family integrated churches, like families in a sense should have this very strong agency such that they are not even going to listen to another pastor's sermon, but also it's very prescriptive to fundamentalism. So there's a constant tension there. And sometimes I wonder if maybe because the overarching doctrine grants so little agency, everything is submit to God's will in these very prescribed ways, that then it becomes very particular in the ways you can have control. Like, okay, I am going to mill my bread then. Like, this becomes very important. And the same thing with boundaries, because I think that's where I mean, where do we land as far as, like, I would want to say, I don't know, to the handful of people listening or watch this later, the sense of this is a theoretical discussion, but I recognize that there are people listening who are, like you had said, engaging this content or different things. And the last thing I ever would want when people are engaging conversation with us is that they feel judged or shamed or kind of like picked apart or something.
Yeah.
And I think the freedom to choose, I think a distinction for someone maybe who's like a crunchy person, who's like, I like, that's the lifestyle I like. The freedom where it verges, I liked your definition of fundamentalism, is do you have the permission that other people can operate in a different way? Like, is there a capacity to have boundaries, or a capacity to see that others have different preferences and values, or see God's instruction in different ways and want to interpret it, versus, no, it must be this way for me and all my children for generations, you know?
Yeah. I refer to this quote a lot, but it struck me so much when I heard it. I was listening to, maybe I've even used this on a live here before, I don't remember, but I was listening to a podcast where Emily Oster, she's a researcher and sociologist who studies parenthood and child development. She was talking about making, decisions about parenting, like, whether to, do baby-led weaning or whatever. And she was just saying that with issues around family and parenting especially, we all want the right decision for us and our particular content to be so right for everybody. And I think that's exactly,
it feels good. We're on the right team, right?
Because, like, I inherited a sourdough starter 2 weeks ago, which I was just dying laughing about as I'm like writing this article.
Right.
But like, it's one of those things that's like, can you have a sourdough starter and really like sourdough bread and have that just be a thing that you and your family have and keep alive? Of course.
Yeah.
But I think it's like, but of course it didn't take long for someone to kind of say to me, like, oh, I'm so glad you'll be so glad. You'll notice right away that it's so much easier to digest. It's so much better.
Yeah.
Like it immediately
it begins to creep.
Like, and here is why this is better than what you've been doing, and but it's better than what other people around you are doing.
Right.
I have this impulse to do that.
And you always have that nagging voice in the back of your head then, if you don't eat the sourdough, where you're like, oh, but I'm having the white bread,
right,
and now I feel like subpar. And I think those conversations are constantly playing around this. Like, even if someone isn't saying, I believe this is the best, there's a sense of like, oh, well, my home was a total wreck today, or there was nothing beautiful in my kitchen, or something like this, that can really become a heavy weight as well, just in day-to-day life. That's probably more a general influencer culture situation. I think too, I really appreciate voices like Tia's. I'm looking forward to reading her memoir, and I appreciated the series she did, because I think the reality of what this looks like can be very serious. I mean, there's a sense of like, can you just have sourdough? Yes, of course. And then there's the reality of what does it look like behind closed doors? What does it look like for the people subsidizing the cost? What does it look like for the children who have been filmed their whole childhood as contents of God? And I think it reminds me a lot of the Duggars, honestly. It's a lot of self-made Duggars because there's that missional impulse that goes with it. So there's the problem of filming children for content across the board, but especially when it's like, don't we all want to do this? This helps people understand God's way, and this will encourage people and all of this. And I think that becomes really confusing around conversations of consent and agency and personhood. So
Yeah.
there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah, there is a lot there. And the whole Tradwife conversation, I mean, there's just so much to talk about that we haven't even, we're over an hour. So
Okay, yeah, right. I know. We can talk for hours.
I just want to, at least acknowledge that there are issues of economic privilege here. There are issues of race at play here, which we've alluded to but not touched on, and white supremacy. There are issues of just domestic labor, domestic abuse, and the ethics of putting your children on screen as evidence that you're doing something right. There's so much to talk about here. Like I said, that I there's so many people doing some really thoughtful writing out there about that, but I do think it's worth talking about because that Tradwife content is very much a part of the Christian parenting influencer ecosystem now. That we're going to keep on running into it in our research, and it is also, at least in my view, going to continue to exert influence on that that gets seen, like it gets made. And I think that that's going to introduce some probably some not so great incentives in terms of what Christian parenting content or popular Christian parenting content looks like and what to the top. I just think that the incentives are all around not so great.
It's not great, and what gets traction. Like I see this even this week. Last thing I'll say, we can sign off, but there was that viral video of a bunch of young women dancing, and whatever you think of the young women dancing, it was fascinating to see the tradwife, not necessarily the influencers, I'm thinking more on Twitter, but the people kind of advocating for that lifestyle, the very strong pushback. And again, it comes with an edge of, probably depends on the platform, but an edge of cruelty in certain places where it's not enough that you disapprove of or don't like that. It's then that these people are subhuman. They're, they're not marriage material. Whatever the categorizations are happening, it becomes a very, there's a real underbelly of, maybe it's that extraordinarily toxic version of masculinity you're talking about, like if you don't make the cut, you're out. But it's right there in many forms. So I do think steady diets of this sort of thing via influencer content, even if you're there for the sourdough, if you're having a steady diet of it, you are absorbing some of those things as well. And it changes you. It really does. Yeah, it changes the way you interact and the way you see people. And yeah, I don't know. So we talk about this a lot. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, but it probably will just have it'll only show up a small bit in our book, probably, if at all, right?
I know.
We will have a chapter on Christian influencing, right? We have that Christian influencer, so maybe a little corner of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we have a chapter on Dominionism and patriarchy, or a chapter, I should say. I don't know. We're reworking our chapter outline, but we'll touch on that.
And on motherhood and fatherhood, I think is where this will also come up, because like we said at the beginning, the vision of ideal Christian motherhood that's sort of on display in this content, like, is nothing new. It's been there and continues to show up as a model for all kinds of reasons. So, but yeah, it is kind of funny. It's taking up so much of our attention, but in the book itself, it'll probably be pretty minor. But
I feel like this was all our research. Like, we're on a research kick, and people listening in get a month solid of this one thing, and then it won't be in the book, but this is the research to undergird it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But speaking of other research and stuff, we talk about a little bit about what's next, what we're planning on doing next. So we will continue to do, we're hoping to do a live every couple of weeks, but we might do the next one a little bit sooner, so stay tuned for that. I want to talk, you've been doing most of
Yeah, I've been deep in the weeds of corporal punishment, so I kind of derail. I try and follow the way. I feel like we're still in such a broad research stage that I'm kind of like, oh, the conversation's here, I'll do deep dives over there. So yeah, a conversation about corporal punishment and Christian parenting flared up on Twitter this week, and it's by far the thing that I always get the most pushback on. If you suggest nonviolent ways of Christian parenting, or say the Bible doesn't mandate spanking, it's fascinating the responses you get. It touches a nerve, and I suspect it's more than just parenting methodology. It's really touching on highly valued theologies and worldviews and all and authority structures and all manner of things. So I think that's why it touches nerve. In any case, I planned a bunch of series as a result, and I've been sending a bunch of them out there. But next week, I'm hoping to do some that are a little more kind of an invitation to cultivate empathy for what the actual practices are like for parent and child. And I think it's uncomfortable. I'm a little uncomfortable even with the conversation, but I think that discomfort is important for those who advocate for that practice to really examine. And I think it's something we don't really talk about much, because it's always talked about in these terms that keep things at an arm's length. So I've got a couple series coming up for that, as well as one kind of wondering about different reasons why I think Christian parents are really reluctant to give up corporal punishment, why it's such a no, we have to have this. And so I'm thinking of both of those things, and kind of another roundup. I did a Substack post today rounding up all the stuff I've been working on with that. So if anyone, you can find all that linked in there. But what about you?
Yeah. Well, I'm planning on hopping a little bit on there just to talk about not so much the related but different. When I hear the conversation about corporal punishment, I'm interested in the history of why evangelicals are very uncomfortable applying ethics and rights framework to parenting. And I am gearing up some research on the parents' rights movement which is very related to that. And so I'll probably do a couple of either responses to the ones that you've posted already, or to the planning on doing, just about things like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the religious lobby against that in the U.S., and the reasons why particular ethical frameworks are really hard for evangelical parents to apply, the reason why kind of bad uses of utilitarianism sort of show up when people start to corporal punishment, all of those things. So that'll probably be a little mini series. I don't know how many.
That sounds really interesting. I'm interested in that. And I get quite a few questions from people asking things like, is it possible? And I think it's probably not, but to begin to pinpoint, when does this become such a markedly Christian ingredient versus, okay, well, kind of accepted that corporal punishment is something is going on with everyone. When does it become specifically Christian, and different things like that? So I think all of that plays into that conversation.
Yeah, the history of that is really, really fascinating. And I don't have a complete handle on it, but what I know so far is pretty interesting, and I think it helps. I don't know, it helps diffuse a little bit of the language or the debate around what do we really know it's that bad for kids, or what do the studies at some point, people who believe that it's what the Bible says that don't really care what the studies say, must know something that we don't know. God knows something we don't understand.
Well, and Tripp even says that. He's like, you've got to accept it on faith. I think he uses that language, you got to trust God's ways are best. So I think absolutely, if Christian parents are ever going to reconsider it, if they believe it's God's way, it will come via conversations about hermeneutics and exegesis that say that's not, ethics that invite them to a way to think of children as humans and treat them as neighbors, and probably coming from other Christians saying it. So, I mean, I think all the things are good reasons, but I really think those are the most effective ways to invite people to consider an alternate way. Because yeah, absolutely, when you're Christ versus culture, of course. And I think there's an admiralty that's an admirable piece of Christian faith to say we value God's word over our own, but wow, it can lead to some wild places, untethered, untempered. So yeah.
Well, I'm excited to see what you come up with next, and talk to you about that hopefully sometime, maybe in a little over a week or something like that. We'll schedule one of these, and I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe Friday night again, maybe not. We might try some different times.
I try the weekend, or I don't know. See where it squeaks in. It's always good to see you and talk with you.
So good to talk to you too, and thanks for coming in and out, joining us, and conversation. So we'll post this whole thing on YouTube. Probably post it on Instagram too, but I've been told that it's very hard to watch on Instagram. So this will be on YouTube probably.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody who's still with us.
Good night.